Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Thursday, 8 February 2024. In my immediately previous episode on Christopher Hill, I quoted from his book, The Century of Revolution, 1613 to 1714, from the introduction, which I will repeat now. Quote, "The transformation that took place in the 17th century is then far more than merely a constitutional or political revolution, or a revolution in economics, religion, or taste. It embraces the whole of life. Two conceptions of civilization were in conflict. One took French absolutism for its model, the other the Dutch Republic. The object of this book is to try to understand the changes which set England on the path of parliamentary government, economic advance, and imperialist foreign policy, of religious toleration and scientific progress," unquote. Arguably, England did not exactly follow either the French or Dutch models of royal absolutism or republicanism. England's path, we could say, represents a distinct conception of civilization, and from Hill's paragraph, we could derive a taxonomy of conceptions of civilization, which would be the absolutist, the republican, and constitutional monarchy. This sounds like a taxonomy of political systems, but in the paragraph I just quoted, Hill does widen the scope to include economics, diplomacy, religion, and science. Civilizations involve all of these things and many more. These conceptions of civilization in Hill are mostly left implicit. They're not developed for their own sake, because Hill was a historian. He wanted to tell the story of the development of a conception of civilization, or more specifically, he wanted to tell the development of English civilization in the 17th century and how it differed from adjacent conceptions and adjacent implementations of these distinct conceptions of civilization. And I want to contrast this to Pitirim Sorokin, who I talked about in the last but one episode, who, by contrast to Hill, did develop an explicit taxonomy. Sorokin was primarily a sociologist, and as a sociologist, he wanted a scientific classification of societies. In my episode on Sorokin, I quoted from his book, The Crisis of Our Age, which was essentially the crisis of the 20th century. How far that is to extend isn't exactly clear. But for Sorokin, this crisis of the 20th century was due to a transition on a civilizational scale, a change from one kind of civilization into another. This is reminiscent of what Hill was doing in his book when he was discussing the changes that were facing early modern England. But instead of framing it in historical terms and talking in terms of civilization, Sorokin uses terms of what he calls cultural supersystems, which are the highest category, or the highest taxon, if you will, of a taxonomy of societies. Quote from Sorokin: "We are seemingly between two epochs, the dying sensate culture of our magnificent yesterday and the coming ideational culture of the creative tomorrow. We are living, thinking, and acting at the end of a brilliant 600-year-long sensate day. The oblique rays of the sun still illume the glory of the passing epoch, but the light is fading, and in the deepening shadows it becomes more and more difficult to see clearly and to orient ourselves safely in the confusions of twilight. The night of the transitory period begins to loom before us with its nightmares, frightening shadows, heartrending horrors. Beyond it, however, the dawn of a great new ideational culture is probably waiting to greet the men of the future," unquote. Sorokin is, in addition to marking out these broad distinctions of kinds of societies, cultural supersystems, as he calls them, Sorokin is especially concerned to make the point that this is a transition among civilizations. This is not a civilization coming to an end. So the 20th century, or the crisis of the 20th century, was not the death rattle of a civilization. It was the transformation of a civilization from one cultural supersystem into another. So another quote, "The meaning of the decline of the sensate phase of our cultural supersystem does not mean an end to Western culture, nor the perdition of Western civilization. It means the end of the fundamental phase and a transition to another phase of the supersystem. In this sense, our theory of the decline of the sensate phase has little in common with other theories of the death of Western culture, or of the perdition of the Western population, or of the liquidation of the material and immaterial values of Western society, or of the doom of the Western culture and society. Based mainly on organic analogies, all such theories are fallacious. Instead of the death of Western culture and society, our conception embraces only an end to one of the phases of its supersystem and a shift to another phase, fuller and less one-sided, possibly neo-ideational, if not neo-idealistic. Such a conception is free from the morbid pessimism of all the theories of the death of culture and society," unquote. I think it's pretty obvious that Spengler is the target in a passage like this. Sorokin does mention Spengler once in the book, The Crisis of Our Age. I didn't check mentions in his other major works. But this is precisely the thing that Spengler and many others were saying, that the decline of the West was the death of a civilization. Sorokin not only identified some crises as a result of civilizational transition, but he also was, as I mentioned earlier, was concerned to create a taxonomy of the kinds of civilization, or rather what he calls cultural supersystems. There's, of course, an old debate in this over the definition of culture and the definition of civilization, and the extent to which they overlap or coincide. I'm not going to address that at the present. Suffice it to say that Hill uses civilization, Sorokin primarily uses culture, and they're talking about very similar things. The taxonomy that Sorokin formulates is a tripartite taxonomy of ideational, idealistic, and sensate supersystems, which very roughly we can understand as spiritual, mixed, and materialistic paradigms. I admire Sorokin's attempt to formulate a taxonomy and to make it explicit, because it demonstrates an interest in the theoretical foundations of what he's talking about. I don't find the result particularly satisfying, though. It can serve as a point of departure, as a spur to former thought, but it's an initial attempt at a large-scale taxonomy of cultural forms. If we want to work with something like this, we need to build on it, and we need to elaborate it, or elaborate something else and use Sorokin as a cautionary tale of what not to do. Well, we can't just stop there and say this is good enough. An adequate taxonomy of cultures or civilization would be the work of what Imre Lakatos called a scientific research program. And it would involve many, many researchers working literally over generations, like what we see in contemporary physics and the elaboration of the standard model. And even those who deviate from the standard model, these are groups of researchers connected internationally who are working at the big universities all around the world with big physics programs, and they exchange ideas over generational scales of time, and you build up a very sophisticated model, and the underlying physics is simple compared to societies and civilizations. In the philosophy of science, Rudolf Carnap made a tripartite distinction among the kinds of concepts that are used in science. He talked about classificatory, comparative, and quantitative concepts. The taxonomies I've been talking about are classificatory concepts. That is to say, they are concepts of classifications. They are taxonomic concepts. We could just as well call Carnap's first type of concept a taxonomic concept. Carnap gives that discusses that in this book, Philosophical Foundations of Physics, and also as well in other texts. I'll quote from one of them. Quote, a classificatory concept, for example, warm, serves for classifying things into two kinds. A comparative concept is a relation based on comparison with the sense of more in a certain respect, i.e., for example, warmer, or more or equal. A quantitative concept serves to describe something with the help of numerical values, for example, temperature, unquote. This has been a very influential schematism of scientific concepts, and it has been largely, though not always, treated as a genetic relationship among the concepts. You start with the simplest taxonomic concepts, and then you move up to comparative concepts, which give you a little more information, and then you move up to quantitative concepts, which give you even more information, and there you've reached, implicitly you've reached a mature scientific discipline when it is expressed in quantitative concepts. We find something like this in Carl Hempel's book, Fundamentals of Concept Formation in Empirical Science. It's a wonderful book for a logical, positive conception of science, and I've learned a lot from it, though I don't necessarily follow it in all its details. It's a great read, though. But when we treat scientific concepts as evolving through stages, from classifying to comparative to quantitative concepts, it implies that quantitative concepts are the endpoint at which we've reached a mature conception of science. But I've been thinking about this for many years, and I've come to realize that a good taxonomy is sometimes what comes last of all in the formulation of a science. It's not difficult to come up with the spontaneous, informal taxonomies. People do that all the time. We improvise as we're going along and make distinctions and group things together. In fact, that's one of the themes of the introduction or the preface to Foucault's The Order of Things, when he talks about the definition in Borges, the fictional definition in a Borges story. It's amusing and well worth reading in any case. So a spontaneous taxonomy is not difficult, but a spontaneous taxonomy is maybe where you start, and hopefully you go far beyond that as you work through the examples and counterexamples that you inevitably encounter when you're elaborating some scientific idea. An adequate taxonomy would require a lot more work, and an optimal taxonomy is, you could say, an ideal of science that towards which we strive, but which is not often realized in fact. In history, we fall far, far short of the scientific ideal, and I would say we even fall short of a minimal, I should say, scientific adequacy. So can history do better? Can we formulate classificatory, comparative, and quantitative concepts for history? We could argue that these concepts are implicit in history. And when we find ourselves facing distinctively historical problems that are the kind that historians deal with, like those that Hill and Sorokin were wrestling with, we are in need of some kind of conceptual framework. And the more adequate it is, the more easily and readily we can deal with these problems and give a coherent account of the history and the societies we're talking about. The problems implied by Christopher Hill in discussing conceptions of civilization, and the problems that were made a little more explicit by Sorokin when he discussed cultural supersystems, could be formulated specifically in terms of civilizations, in which we would be developing an abstract theory of civilization, or they could be formulated in terms of history, in which we would be developing an abstract theory of history. But Hill's interest is in history itself, not in the theory of history. And Sorokin's interest is primarily, although not exclusively, in sociology, not a theory of history or a theory of civilization, though Sorokin's work does have wider theoretical ambitions, which is what makes it one of the things that makes it so interesting. He's not just read by sociologists, he's read by people in many different disciplines. But these problems mostly remain implicit, and because the problems mostly remain implicit in historical work and in sociological work, the concepts remain largely implicit. There are those who have worked on making these ideas explicit and formulating an abstract theory of history or an abstract theory of civilization. And of course, these efforts also have their naysayers. Karl Popper, most famously in The Poverty of Historicism, said of the very possibility of a theoretical history, quote, "We must reject the possibility of a theoretical history, that is to say, of a history of a historical social science that would correspond to theoretical physics. There can be no scientific theory of historical development serving as a basis for historical prediction," unquote. Karl Popper does not mention Sorokin once in The Poverty of Historicism, but he may have had Sorokin in mind because he does discuss sociology quite a bit and says in one place, quote, "The historicist claims that sociology is theoretical history," unquote. And that's sort of what Sorokin was doing. And Popper says that he's dead wrong and bound to fail because this is just there can't be a theoretical history. But Popper's claims are qualified several times over, and few people who actually work on the problems of a theoretical history or a theory of civilization actually meet all those qualifications. So you could say that they slip the net that Popper tries to catch them in. But Popper's criticism of the very possibility of theoretical history has had so much influence that you could say that it has discouraged a lot of work, and Popper and those like him who have criticized the very idea of a theoretical history or a theory of history, many of them historians themselves, traditionalists who think that the only kind of history is a narrative history written in prose, have probably hobbled the progress of history toward making it into an actual scientific discipline. And saying that you want to develop a theory of history is almost enough to place you under a cloud, certainly among historians, maybe even among philosophers of history who are primarily today interested in specifically philosophical problems, you know, the analytical philosophy of history as distinguished from substantive philosophy of history. There's several different ways to formulate this distinction, which I mentioned in an earlier episode. If you're doing analytical philosophy of history, you're primarily interested in philosophical problems as applied to history and not talking about history itself, which is what substantive philosophy of history is. And I think a theoretical history or a theory of history would be substantively talking about historical events and the nature of history itself and the historical process. And that has suffered, whether it has suffered as a result of those who have claimed it was impossible and therefore discouraged it, or it's suffered because it's a difficult task, or it's suffered from lack of interest. It's difficult to say. Maybe all of these things together. But there is a lot of work yet that could be done in the sphere of theoretical history, however we choose to define it. So thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you another time.